We all know the story of Moshe Rabbeinu. Although he grew up as a prince in Paro's palace, it was known that he was the adopted son of Paro's daughter, albeit with Hebrew origins. The Torah relates how he came to the palace, and then continues on to tell us the story of his coming of age. It happened in those days when Moshe had grown up that he went out to his brothers and looked at their burdens. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brothers. He looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the second day, and behold, 2 men of the Hebrews were fighting with each other. He said to him who did the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you plan to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moshe was afraid and said, "Surely this thing is known." Now when Paro heard this thing, he sought to kill Moshe. But Moshe fled from the face of Paro and lived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. When looking at this passage in the Torah, there are 2 questions that come to mind when looking at his interaction with the Hebrew. 1, of what was Moshe afraid? And 2, to what was Moshe referring to when he said that surely this thing is known? What is now known that wasn't known before? Possibility number 1. Now it would be known that Moshe killed an Egyptian. Moshe killed an Egyptian man because the Egyptian was hitting the Hebrew man. It would seem reasonable to believe that these strikes on the Hebrew were meant to kill and not just for maiming or holding to order. Moshe, as we see, went to save the Hebrew, just as we see later on that he would save Yitro's daughters from the shepherds of Midian. But before he saved the Hebrew, the Torah tells us that Moshe carefully looked around to make sure that no one saw what he was about to do. Evidently, it wasn't enough. The Bechor Shor wrote, "Achen, kamo ach ken." Klomar, eno kamo shayiti savor, ach ken hu shanoda. The word achen is like saying ach ken. Nevertheless, it is so. It wasn't as I had thought, yet nevertheless, the deed is now known. So of what was Moshe afraid? That he wasn't careful enough in his actions. And we see that his fear was justified as immediately afterwards Paro tried to execute him. Possibility number 2. Now it was known that Moshe identified himself more as a Hebrew than as an Egyptian. A number of commentators note that Moshe went out to see the Hebrew suffering as he saw himself as one of them and wanted to know firsthand as to their well-being. Note, if he saw the Hebrews as his people and wanted to identify with them, then that meant that even though he had grown up as a prince in Paro's palace and was the adopted son of Paro's daughter, he still saw himself as a Hebrew and not an Egyptian. As long as he didn't step over the line, Paro would tolerate him. However, the moment that Moshe publicly identified himself as a Hebrew and killed the Egyptian, Paro responded, "If Moshe so much wants to be a Hebrew when he could easily have been an Egyptian, then so be it. He will now be treated as a Hebrew who killed an Egyptian." Accordingly, the Torah tells us that Paro sought to kill him, and Moshe ran away. As an aside, if Moshe was regarded as Paro's son, then why would a father try to kill his own son even if he was wayward? As a father, Paro could have forgiven Moshe even for the most dastardly of deeds, yet we see no forgiveness towards Moshe during Paro's lifetime. After Hashem reveals himself to Moshe, he specifically makes the point that Moshe can now safely return to Egypt, as all those who sought him are now dead. Rashbam adds in particular, the Paro who tried to kill you is himself now dead. From this, it would seem to be that perhaps this Paro who wanted to execute Moshe was more of a rival to Moshe, possibly growing up together or as an uncle and contender for the throne. Now, with the killing of the Egyptian, Paro had a legitimate excuse to get rid of his rival Moshe. Possibility number 3. Now Moshe understands why Bnei Israel are enslaved to another nation. The Midrash Rabbah explains what happened here. Moshe was wondering why out of all the nations was Israel as a nation enslaved to Egypt. What did they do to deserve it, and moreover have it continue? When Moshe understood that they tattletaled on a fellow Hebrew to the Egyptian authorities, he wondered no longer. Moshe had grown up in Paro's palace. He knew that he was a Hebrew, but couldn't understand why his fellow Hebrews were still enslaved. By hearing and experiencing the evil speech of his brethren, he understood why they remained enslaved and were not yet free. It's not that the informing itself was the reason for the continued enslavement, but was the symptom of what was causing divisions among the people and preventing them from coming together and allowing them to be redeemed. There was no united we stand, but only divided we fall. He now feared for their future, yet couldn't do anything about it, as Paro was now after him too. Shabbat Shalom.